Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So in my last episode in this series, I discussed what the sentencing gap was and the basic causes behind it, which is a natural preference to protect women over men. Now this episode I want to look at the way feminism and feminists are responding to the sentencing gap, and in most cases they're just ignoring it and pretending that it doesn't exist. But there have been some responses and I want to have a close look at them. But first, I think it would be good to recap the last episode by reading an article which I found which pretty much summed up what I had to say. And I think you'll find it very, very interesting. So, let's have a look at that.
People are more likely to protect women than men. People naturally care more about a woman's welfare than a man's when it comes to both the saving of lives and pursuit of self-interest. A study by postdoctoral students at New York University shows most people are hardwired to put women first. The research, conducted at Cambridge University's Medical Research Council's Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit and Columbia University, appears this week in the journal Social Psychological and Personality Science. In one experiment, study subjects read one of three versions of a trolley dilemma, a commonly used technique in psychology studies and akin to the lifeboat question. In the trolley scenario, subjects read one of three versions of the dilemma, where each vignette described a man, woman, or gender-neutral bystander on the bridge. The participants were then asked how willing they were to push the man-woman person onto the path of the oncoming trolley, in order to save five others farther down the track. The results showed that both female and male subjects were much more likely to push the male bystander or one of unspecified gender than they were the female bystander. In a second experiment, a new group of subjects was given £20 and told that any money they held at the end of the experiment would be multiplied up to tenfold. However, there was a catch. The subjects were told that if they decided to keep the money, other individuals would be subjected to mild electric shocks. However, if they gave up the money, it would prevent the shocks from being administered. As with the first experiment, women were less likely than men to be subjected to shocks, suggesting an aversion to harming females, even when this came at the subject's own financial expense. A third experiment was a survey in which a new set of more than 350 subjects was asked a series of questions relevant to the study's focus. Specifically, the researchers aimed to sort out the thought process that might explain the behaviors exhibited in the first two experiments. Overall, the answers of both female and male respondents suggested that social norms account for greater harming behavior toward a male than a female. Target women are less tolerant to pain, it's unacceptable to harm females for personal gain, and society endorses chivalrous behavior. There is indeed a gender bias in these matters. Society perceives harming women as more morally unacceptable, explains co-author Dean Mobbs, an assistant professor of psychology at Columbia University.
Now we really shouldn't be surprised by this article. If you watched the last video in this series, basically you should know that there is preference towards women. In most cases men are seen as more disposable, and women's welfare is generally seen as more important or more urgent. In fact, it's something which can be summed up in this entire series, which is a response to Garrett. Basically, it's gynocentrism. Now, as a segue into the next part of this video, I thought we would have a quick look at a comment in the comment section of that particular article. Here we go. Take it away, Titus Groan.
If you think that men's rights groups give a shit about the men who actually need them, you're mistaken. If you're anything but white, straight, employed and a decent weight, they couldn't care less. Take one look at the articles on Return of Kings and you'll find out very quickly how important realistic men's issues are to them.
Oh, Return of Kings, that typical men's rights site, right? Return of Kings. Now, a couple of people pointed out to him that Return of Kings isn't a men's rights site, and he responded later on by claiming that Return of Kings is the quintessential MRA page. Well done, Titus. Well done. Yes, Return of Kings is the quintessential MRA page, just like Mein Kampf is the quintessential piece of feminist literature, right? I mean, if you can bullshit, so can I, mate. But Titus goes on to say, and this is actually the important point of his comment,
something needs to dismantle gender stereotypes. I don't care if it's feminism, but it needs to be done, and right now, feminists, actual feminists, not the ones journal i.e. writers invent in their heads, plotting the demise of men, are the only ones fighting for that.
Okay, so 3 points so far. The first one is that people in general are more concerned about the welfare and safety of women than that of men. The second point is this translates into what we see in sentencing, where men typically get 63% longer sentences for the exact same crimes as committed by women, on average. And the third point is that feminists like Titus claim that feminism is actually out there trying to address this and break down gender roles and change all this for the betterment of society and men and women and just everyone. Feminism is for everyone after all, right? So this third point is the one I want to look at during this video. Is feminism actually concerned about men's issues and men's rights and things like the sentencing gap? So to be fair, let's start with the positives. Unfortunately, in my experience, I can only name 3. The first one is Christina Hoff Sommers. I showed her video in my last video in this series, in which she was talking about the sentencing gap, so I'm not going to show it again here. But yes, she is one of the very few feminists who has actually talked about the sentencing gap and basically come out and said it's wrong. And she's typically hated by most mainstream feminists. The second person the second feminist, I should say, who I've heard speak out against the sentencing gap is Garrett.
Nothing really to say here. This is important. It needs to change. And one good thing is that it is at least being looked into at high levels, if not yet actually being addressed.
So I know at times I've been critical of Garrett during this series, but look, I believe in giving credit where credit is due, and this is one of the cases where he gets it right. So well done, Garrett. So the third example I've found is on a website called the Good Men Project. Now, if you don't know what the Good Men Project is, it's basically a bunch of male feminists who pretty much pretend to advocate for male rights, kind of a little bit-ish. You know, the typical thing that we get where they say, yeah, men in today have issues. If we can just give women equality and smash the patriarchy, then all these issues will just kind of disappear, because feminism helps men too. Now, all the stuff in this may not be that bad, but a lot of it is. But this article on the sentencing gap isn't too bad, so I thought we would have a look at it and go through it bit by bit and see what they've got to say.
The sentencing gap. Why are men more likely to go to prison? Men are statistically more likely to go to prison than women for the same crime. Feminists and men's rights activists alike should be outraged.
Now, I would agree that both men's rights activists and feminists alike should be outraged over this. Unfortunately, when it comes to feminists, I could only find 3 examples speaking out against it. Now, there may very well be others which I haven't seen, but they don't seem to be all that common when it comes to things like manspreading and toxic masculinity and women having to pay more for raises or some bullshit like that. There seems to be tons of feminists everywhere talking about it all the fucking time. Yet this blatant violation of human rights, which affects men, well, not so many. But anyway, let's continue.
People forget that prisons aren't always there to protect us. In fact, they often aren't there to help us at all. When you have a primarily or entirely privatized penal system, prisons become a business and their primary reason for existing is to make money. In America today, the prison business is booming and men are disproportionately paying the price.
Now, I would agree that there is a good reason to discuss the privatization of prisons in America and presumably elsewhere as well. But I'm not sure if this is the right place to do it. I mean, this discussion is meant to be about discrimination against men, not about evil capitalism taking over the prison system. That's a fine discussion to have another time. Right now, though, we should be discussing the discrimination, the blatant violation of human rights against males. But let's continue with the article. Maybe the rest of it's not too bad.
According to a recent study by Sonia Starr, an assistant law professor at the University of Michigan, men on average receive 63% longer prison sentences than women who commit comparable crimes. Reinforcing data accumulated from numerous other surveys on the subject, Starr also found that women are twice as likely to avoid incarceration if convicted of a crime, which may explain why 90% of the prison population is male, and estimated that the gender gap in sentencing could be as much as 6 times as large as that between white and non-whites. More on that in a moment. Despite this trend, the existing tendency among progressives has been to push for changes that only exacerbate the problem, such as the concerted effort among British feminists to abolish female prisons altogether.
So feminism claims to be about equality for both genders, right? They want equality for everyone. That's what they claim. Now, could you imagine if there was a discrepancy in sentencing where women got 63% longer sentences for the exact same crimes committed by men? We would hear nothing but that in the media. We would hear it constantly, and it would have been changed by now. It would be one of the feminists' main talking points about how we live in a patriarchy and women are oppressed and they're second-class citizens and they're treated badly and blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. We hear it all the fucking time, that type of argument. But the vast majority of them are dead silent when this happens to men. And as the Good Men Project points out, and I give them full credit for this, British feminists are trying to abolish female prisons altogether. In fact, they're trying to widen the gap. Now, keep that in mind for later on in the article.
These facts put advocates of prison reform in a tricky dilemma. On the one hand, leftists who point out that female convicts often have poor mental health or are poorly educated, have not committed violence and have children to look after, aren't wrong. However, because these same traits frequently apply to men who are convicted of crimes, indeed, a compelling case could be made that they describe a considerable fraction of our prison population. It speaks volumes that this data is used to widen the sentencing gender gap instead of confront how our sentencing system is fundamentally draconian.
Now, once again, I believe in giving credit where credit is due, and in this case, I have to give full credit to the Good Men Project. This paragraph really sums up the way that all feminists, all MRAs and everyone in society should be viewing the sentencing gap. If you're going to make these excuses for women, then you should be making them for men as well. Or alternatively, be making them for no one. Gender should not be the issue here. It should be the law and the crimes that someone has committed. And if we're going to look at sentencing, we should look at it in a fair and even way across the board and not select one group based on their gender and say this group should get special treatment because vagina. So anyway, let's continue.
After all, the gender gap is far from the only problem facing American prisons today. There is also the problem that police are more likely to target non-whites than whites, who are in turn less likely to be able to afford quality legal counsel. As a result, 1 out of every 3 black males born today will be incarcerated during their lifetime, as compared to 1 out of 6 Latino males and 1 out of 17 white males. According to the 2010 census, almost 1 in 10 black men between the ages of 20 and 34 were in prison. By contrast, the numbers for white men in the same block was roughly 1 in 50. Needless to say, non-whites make up a majority of the more than 2.4 million people living behind bars as of March 2014, a number that is likely to be much higher than 3 million when you take recidivism rates into account.
Look, someone's intersectionality is showing. And they were doing so well too. Now, look, it is a fair point that we should be discussing race as well. Clearly, there is an issue in America with black males who are being arrested and sent to prison, and as the report shows, that they're more likely to end up in prison with a longer sentence than white males, for example. So part of this is obviously discrimination. I'd also say one of the reasons why there is such a high African American prison population is because of factors like poverty and maybe education and other complex issues which I'm not going to go into right now. But even though race is an issue, as the Good Men Project pointed out earlier in this article, Dr. Sonia Starr discovered that gender is 6 times more of a factor than race. So yes, if you're black, you are more likely to go to prison than if you are white. But if you are male, you're more likely to go to prison than female. And the difference between race and gender is 6 times. Clearly, this is a bigger issue. So maybe we should focus on all men, at least for this article, which is meant to be about gender. But still, it's not doing too bad. It's far better than what I expected when I started reading it. So let's continue.
Of course, because the American prison industrial complex is incredibly lucrative. As of 2013, it was worth $70 billion. Politicians are influenced by lobbyists for groups like the Corrections Corporation of America to create laws that put more people in jail rather than fewer, especially through tighter drug laws. As a result, Americans have been left with a penal system in which poor boys, particularly of color, are more likely to go to prison for the same crime as a rich white girl.
Yeah, this is true, but a poor white boy is still more likely to go to prison than a poor white girl. In fact, a poor white boy is more likely to go to prison than a poor black girl. So yes, privatization of prisons and race are also factors, but I was kind of hoping this article would just focus on gender, considering that's never talked about. And it would have been nice if they brought up gynocentrism, but there's still time. Let's see where they go with this.
In short, the issue of the prison industrial complex is an intersectional one encompassing state corruption, capitalism run amok, race, and when it comes to the heavier sentencing for men, gender inequality. So why isn't the last issue receiving more attention?
That's a very good question. I know it's one I've been asking a very long time now. Let's see what they have to say about it.
A lot of times these issues will get drowned out because of highly public fighting between men's rights activists and feminists, which winds up overshadowing the legitimate concerns that many MRAs have, explained Adam Hollingsworth, a men's rights activist who was interviewed for this article. The sentencing gap should be a large issue not only for men's rights activists, but for feminists. It is a clear example of how our justice system treats women as if they have less agency and are thus less accountable for their actions. The problem, it seems, is that it is often much easier to put men in jail. As Hollingsworth implicitly pointed out, the conventional assumption is that women can't hack it in prison, whether because they need to raise families, or are too emotionally frail, or literally lack the physical strength to survive behind bars. Within this zeitgeist, a man who steps up and takes prison time for a woman can be depicted as chivalrous and noble. Inversely, a man who expected a woman to do the same thing, meanwhile, would seem dishonorable and cowardly.
All very good points, and once again I have to give credit to the Good Men Project for actually coming out and asking a men's rights activist. Well done. So let's continue.
It must be emphasized that this story isn't about calling women out for using the woman card, but about making sure that both genders are equally accountable for their actions. In America, the popular cliché among the law and order set is that, if you do the crime, you should do the time. It says nothing about what you have in your pants, in any justice system that factors that into its decisions, knowingly or unknowingly, is reinforcing patriarchal assumptions that simultaneously demean women and are unjust to men. Logically speaking, there is no getting around the fact that in a free society, the same sentences should be meted out regardless of sex.
Now, for the most part, I would agree with this particular paragraph. The one thing that I do have a problem with, though, is the bit where it says reinforcing patriarchal assumptions. I wouldn't have used the word patriarchal there. Now, there is some truth in this. You could have used the term gender roles, I guess. That might have been more accurate. I think an even more accurate term would have been gynocentric. But it's interesting, but not surprising, but interesting that they use the term patriarchal, because the feminists actually trying to widen the sentencing gap also blame the patriarchy or use the patriarchy as an excuse, which is interesting because they're arguing the exact opposite thing. And this is one of the main issues I have with feminist theory. It can be so flexible. So we have a situation here where men are getting discriminated against, and well, that's because of patriarchy, and that's wrong. But at the same time, we have academic feminists who are arguing that because of patriarchy, that practice should not only continue, but it should be increased. How can these two things simultaneously be correct? But let me give you an example of some of the academic feminists. Now, I have a paper here called Patriarchy, Crime and Justice, Feminist Criminology in an Era of Backlash, from 2006. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire thing. It's 21 pages long. I'll link below. You can read it yourself if you want. It's something that if I was going to go through, I'd do a whole video on. And I've just got too much material to go through in this video without going through a 21-page report. So the too long didn't read version is, we live in a evil patriarchal society which causes innocent and otherwise pure women to commit crimes, and therefore it's not really their fault when they commit crimes. It's the fault of patriarchy, and when they're sent to the masculine prison system, they're victimized a second time. So we really should take pity on them. It even goes as far to say that the increase in female violence over the last 20 or 30 years isn't really an increase at all, and this is just all media bias against females who like to portray women as the bad girls. And this is just, once again, patriarchy demonizing women by portraying them as criminals in the media, which is strange considering the vast majority of criminals portrayed in the media are male. Apparently we can't have any female criminals in the media. We can't spotlight any female crimes because, as this article describes it, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Apparently a woman seeing another woman commit a crime on the news is going to somehow, I don't know, brainwash her into becoming a criminal herself. It's the patriarchy. It's the patriarchy doing it. It's the patriarchy oppressing women, which is why we're more likely to have sympathy for them and give them lighter sentences. Yeah. And, we also see it in feminist literature like this, Off Our Backs, the Feminist News Journal, Trapped by Patriarchy, Women in Prison. And once again, it's the same narrative. The poor women, it's not their fault. It's different circumstances when women commit crimes. It's not the same as when men commit crimes, because when men commit crimes, well, it's because they're men, right? That's what men do. But women are something different. They're more noble, they're more pure. And if they commit a crime, well, it's obviously the patriarchy and somehow toxic masculinity, I don't know, brainwashing them or forcing them into it. And they're all victims anyway, so, we have to give them a special break based on gender. Now, this is the exact opposite of what the Good Men Project is saying. How can both be true? How can you simultaneously believe that patriarchy is doing both these things? That's why patriarchy is a fucking bullshit term. It's thrown around like conspiracy theorists throw around fucking Illuminati. It's almost as bad, and in some ways it's fucking worse, because the people throwing around patriarchy are university educated. They're not backyard fucking professors who believe the world is run by fucking shape-shifting reptilians. These are educated people at universities. But let's continue. We're almost through the Good Men Project article.
Instead, truly meaningful prison reform should focus on a. Creating racial, gender, and economic equity in the distribution of justice, and b. Cranking up pressure on politicians so that they will stop finding reasons to incarcerate people. Certainly we can start with lessening offenses on minor drug charges, particularly those involving marijuana. Finding alternative methods of rehabilitation for juvenile offenders convicted of committing petty crimes, particularly those that focus on community participation and remembering that it takes a village to raise a child. And making sure that our prisons take the severity of a convict's mental illness into account when determining how he or she should be treated during their incarceration. If nothing else, however, any feminist should be outraged to know the statistics about the sentencing gap. It is proof that fellow human beings are receiving unjust and unequal treatment, even as it simultaneously demonstrates that our justice system has a misogynistic mentality based on outdated assumptions about women being the weaker sex.
So, is the sentencing gap misogynistic? I would have to say that the sentencing gap is misogynistic in exactly the same way that feminism is misogynistic. When you reduce women to helpless victims who don't have agency and can't take responsibility for their actions, yes, that is misogynistic. You're not treating them as equal, responsible human beings. And that is exactly what feminism constantly does to females. That's why we have an ever-growing number of female anti-feminists. But if you're going to claim that the sentencing gap is misogynistic, you should also claim that it is misandric, especially considering that males are the main victims here. Even though it is misogynistic against women, they are benefiting from that, in the sense that they're not doing equal time for equal crimes. Men, on the other hand, are doing much longer, harder sentences for the exact same crimes. So really that should be our focus here, not the fact that it's misogynistic, but the fact that it is hurting men. But I guess it always has to be about the women, doesn't it?
This is a cause in which feminists should find common cause with men's rights activists, in the same spirit that Emma Watson articulated to the United Nations last September. Gender equality is your issue too.
Okay, since we've now looked at the good, let's have a look at the bad and the ugly.
Why we should close women's prisons and treat their crimes more fairly. By Mirko Bagaric.
Now, to be 100% fair, I could not find if Mirko Bagaric is actually a feminist or not, and he doesn't actually mention feminism anywhere in this article. So it is a possibility that Professor Mirko Bagaric is in fact not a feminist. But this article which he has written does mirror all the feminist articles perfectly, and we'll have a look at that a bit later. He basically uses all the exact same talking points. So in that sense, I think it's fair to use this article. Now, the reason why I'm going with this article as opposed to the others is because this is the most recent one, and I think it's a good summary of those other articles, which hopefully I'll have a bit of time to have a look at before the end of this video. Now, none of you have probably ever heard of Professor Mirko Bagaric. I know I never had. He is actually a law professor here in Victoria. But let's have a look at his article.
Women almost never scare us. Commit random acts of serious violence. Violate our sexual integrity. Or form organized crime networks, and yet their prisons numbers are now the highest in recorded history.
Okay, so not off to a very good start. He starts off with a a bit of a distraction, a bit of a straw man. He basically says that because women commit less crimes, apparently, and those crimes are less serious, we shouldn't really worry about women committing crimes. If a man does a non-violent crime and a woman does a non-violent crime, well, we should consider that different, right? As opposed to looking at the actual evidence for the crime and the crime committed, we should, base it on gender because of statistics and averages, right? Now, if someone were to suggest we should do this with race, I have no doubt that Professor Mirko Bagaric would claim that that was racist, and he would be fucking right that it's racist. But apparently that's okay to do with gender. Right, Professor? Next.
The homogeneity of the human species breaks down when it comes to criminal behavior. Women, who constitute slightly more than 50% of population, commit only about 20% of all crime. They commit even a lower portion of all serious crime.
Now, I have to ask what these numbers are based upon. Are they based on convictions? Because if women are less likely to be convicted for crimes because they're women, because there is a bias, a natural bias towards protecting women, then these statistics are not going to be accurate, are they? But 20% we could argue is more like, 30%, maybe even higher. If women are getting away with a sentencing discount, where they're basically more likely to be let go when they commit a crime, be it serious or minor, if they're more likely to get sympathy from the court, then we can't go by these statistics. And this professor here is asking that we create an even greater bias. Just fucking amazing that this is coming from a law professor. I shouldn't be surprised, though. I really shouldn't. Next.
Hillary Clinton is right to assert that the sentencing system should be reformed to reduce the growing number of female prisoners, but the changes should go much further than has been suggested. We should implement concrete targets to remove the stains on our landscape and societal ethic that are women's prisons.
Why? Why should we remove women's prisons? Once again, if someone commits a crime, they should be judged on their actions and the evidence, not on their fucking gender.
There are remarkably similar patterns of female offending and incarceration in the United States and Australia. In the United States, women commit only 17% of felonies, while in Australia they commit about 13% of the crimes dealt with in the higher courts.
Now, once again, we can't go with these statistics being 100% accurate if there is a bias in the court, which is going to mean that women are less likely to be convicted and men are more likely to be convicted. We can't say that these statistics are 100% accurate. But for argument's sake, let's say that they are. Let's say it's in the United States it's 17%, right, of felonies. In which case the prison population should be made up of 17% women, right? That would be fair, as opposed to shutting down all women's prisons and letting 17% of felonies go unpunished for some reason because of vagina? Really? Next.
Moreover, when it comes to sexual offenses, rounded off to the nearest whole number, women constitute 0% of all offenders. That's right, 0.
Yeah, and it has nothing to do with the fact that in many countries in the West, women can't even be convicted of rape. It's something only a man can do with his penis, right? But we should just ignore that and pretend that the law is somehow even and equal. And we should just ignore that the court system is less likely to believe that women commit these crimes. And in instances where a man and a woman commit these crimes together, the court is more likely to blame the man, even if the woman is an equal partner in the act. We should just ignore all this and go with the 0% figure, right? And pretend that it's real. Next.
The crimes they most commonly commit are drug and property offenses. Thus, in the U.S., approximately 30% of female prisoners are incarcerated for property offenses, and a further 26% for drug offenses. The percentages for these offenses are 26% and 17%, respectively, in Australia. Women do of course commit homicide offences, but nearly always the victim is a relative and the crime was committed against the backdrop of an abusive relationship or depressive mindset.
And here we have the typical feminist mindset, where we see women as innocent victims who never do anything wrong, couldn't possibly do anything wrong. I mean, it's easy to understand men do bad things, right? Because, you know, they're men, that's what men do. But when a woman commits a crime, oh no, it's not really her fault. It's the patriarchy. It's toxic masculinity. It's she's a victim and she has no fucking agency. Apparently, according to people like this professor, women have no responsibility or no agency for their actions. It's always the fault of someone else. Didn't the Good Men Project article call this patriarchal mindset or misogynistic or something like that? Yeah, it's amazing how flexible these terms are. Next.
All homicides are heinous crimes, but the types of homicides committed by women rarely involve random victims and hence do not engender community fear.
Well, so apparently if you kill a relative or someone you know, it's not as bad as killing a stranger, so therefore, I don't know, you shouldn't go to prison or something. Yeah. Next.
Despite this, the rate of female incarceration in both the United States and Australia is on the increase, far outstripping the increase in male incarceration levels.
Oh, really? Could it be because women are committing more crimes? Do you think maybe that's why it is? Oh, no, of course not. It has to be the system, right? It has to be discrimination. It can't be that women are actually committing more crimes. No, of course not. It's obviously the patriarchy or something. Next.
Women now comprise 8% of prisoners in the United States and Australia, which amounts to more than 200,000 incarcerated inmates in the US and 3,000 in Australia. Nearly every one of these incarcerated women is the victim of a perverse and lazy policy disfigurement that fails to acknowledge the marked differences between female and male offenders.
And here we have it. Here we have it. The marked differences between female and male offenders. So if a man commits a crime and a woman goes and commits the exact same crime, it's not the same thing, apparently. Apparently, when a male does it, you know, it's because he's male. When a female does it, it's because of males or society or other people. It's never her fault. Women have no agency, according to this misogynistic cunt, right? And let's be honest, that's exactly what this is. When you reduce women to nothing but victims, to a victim class, it is fucking misogynistic. And I have to say it, that's what the mainstream feminist movement does. That's one of the reasons I'm an anti-feminist. It's amazing that I get accused of being a misogynist because I'm an anti-feminist, when the mainstream feminist movement is actually a misogynistic movement that reduces women to victims and to a victim class with no agency. How much more fucking misogynistic can you get than that? I actually respect women. That's why I don't see them as a fucking victim class. Next.
The differences are so stark that not only should women be treated more leniently because they commit less serious crime, but they should also be treated more leniently when they commit the same crime as a man.
Now imagine someone was suggesting this based on race, right? So in America, the black community proportionately commits more crime than the white community. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can sum this up as poverty and poor education in certain areas, and of course a biased legal system, right? These are all factors. There are also plenty of others, but these are some of the main factors which affect the fact that there is a higher proportion of African American prisoners in America than white prisoners. But according to this law professor, we should just ignore that. We should just pretend that doesn't exist, and we should say that because there is a higher proportion of black prisoners to white, maybe we should just stop sending whites to prison, right? Because proportionately whites commit less crime, so Yeah, maybe we should just make prisons all about black people. Right, Professor? Oh, hold on. That would be racist, wouldn't it? That would be racist. But it's okay to do that with gender for some reason. Oh, but only if it benefits women, right? You fucking piece of shit. Next.
There are 4 major differences between male and female offenders. First, women are much less likely to reoffend than men. Their recidivism levels are at least 10% lower in both the US and Australia.
Now, this is an argument I've heard over and over again, and it's an interesting one, because if men typically get longer, harsher sentences for the exact same crimes, and men are more likely to reoffend, do you think maybe there is a connection there? Do you think maybe being sent to prison and brutalised and possibly repeatedly raped might affect your mindset when you get out of prison? Possibly another factor is that males who are ex-cons are less likely to find work than females. Maybe there's a bias there, and therefore maybe males have less opportunity and therefore are more likely to reoffend. These are actual factors that we could talk about and explore. But instead, what this professor is suggesting we should just reduce it to penis bad, vagina good for some reason. A fucking law professor. Let's talk about actual factors, you piece of shit. Next.
Second, when women are imprisoned they suffer more. They have higher rates of mental illness, making it more difficult for them to adapt to and cope with the prison setting. And US studies show that when in prison they are 3 times more likely to be victims of sexual abuse than male prisoners.
Well, this is interesting. This is an interesting little statement here. Well, first of all, he starts off by saying that women suffer more because apparently women are weaker than men, according to this piece of shit, and therefore need special treatment, equality, right? But he goes on to say that a US study, which he doesn't name, shows that when in prison they are 3 times more likely to be victims of sexual abuse than male prisoners. Now, that's a very interesting statement, because earlier in this article he did state that women constitute 0% of all offenders when it comes to sexual offences, right? Apparently women in prison are 3 times more likely to be victims of sexual abuse than male prisoners. And he does state when in prison. So we're not talking about stuff that happened before they went to prison. Now, I guess it could be just the guards constantly going around raping female prisoners, in which case wouldn't it be easier just to have all female guards as opposed to shutting down prisons altogether and letting out criminals? Of course, the other explanation could be that it's actually women sexually assaulting other women, which, anyone who actually looks at statistics knows that shit actually happens. Which is why his earlier statement with the 0% is fucking bullshit. But, good job of contradicting yourself here, mate. Keep up the good work. You're making my job so much easier. Next.
Third, society suffers more when we remove a female from it and place her behind the prison wall. More than 50% of incarcerated women are single parents, and even in 2-parent households, female prisoners typically assume the main child nurturing role. In relation to non-parental dependency, the majority of carers, 60%, are females.
Oh, look out. He's actually supporting traditional gender roles here. The mother being the carer, the nurturer of the child. I mean, isn't that the traditional gender role that feminism is trying to pull apart? And, men should do their equal percentage and all the other stuff. But it seems when it suits them, then we should adopt traditional gender roles. It's amazing how flexible this shit is. It really is. But the proper argument here would actually be that parents should get a discount. Now, I'm not saying that is what I believe, but if he was going to be consistent and non-biased, he should say that parents should get a special consideration, be they male or female. but instead he's advocating just for the females. Next.
Finally, women are often less culpable when they commit crime.
Yep, and this one sentence really sums up feminism, doesn't it? It's women are less culpable for everything. Because apparently females have no fucking agency, right? It's just incredible, this bullshit. It really is. And they actually have the nerve to say that MRA is a misogynist. It's just fucking incredible. Next.
There is a profoundly devastating link between child sexual and violent victimization and female offending. U.S. studies show that 23% to 37% of female prisoners reported that they had been physically or sexually abused prior to the age of 18. That rate is even higher in Australia. Incarcerating females is often simply a lamentable case of victimizing the victimized.
And what are the percentages for men, just out of curiosity? Let's assume that these statistics are in fact correct. Let's say that it is 23 to 37%. So what's the male comparison? Is it like 5 to 10%? Is it, I don't know, 15 to 20%? Could it be 23 to 37%? Possibly 50 to 60%? We don't know, because he doesn't present the evidence. He presents part of the evidence, but nothing to compare it to. If he's actually going to argue that this is a more common thing for women, that it's therefore a factor that we should take into consideration, he needs to put forward the male statistics as a fair comparison. Of course, he doesn't, and they never do in these cases. They just put out the female set of statistics, and everyone is meant to just, totally forget about the male factor in it. Apparently, they don't count. It only counts when it's females. Next.
The sentencing system should be reformed radically to deal more fairly with female offending. The starting position is that no female offender should be imprisoned. In relation to most forms of crime, they should be dealt with by way of intermediate sanctions, including the greater use of electronic monitoring. No. Things like race and gender should not be taken into consideration at all. It should be a totally unbiased system in which the person is sentenced based on their actions and the evidence which is against them. That's simple. Having a penis or a vagina should not be a fucking factor, any more than the colour of someone's skin. And the fact that this is coming from a fucking law professor at a university is of great fucking concern to me. This is fucking bullshit. Next. In the rare instances that women commit heinous crimes, community protection and the need to impose proportionate penalties requires a prison term, but this should be the exception, not the increasing norm. The exception is so rare that the utopia of closing prisons would readily become a reality.
Once again, what I'm advocating is equal sentencing for equal crime, right? So if there are less women committing homicides, then there will be less women in prison for homicide. But those women who do commit homicide should get an equal sentence to the males who commit comparable crimes. That's simple. No fucking special treatment, no shutting down women's prisons or all this other bullshit. Gender should not be a fucking issue. That's simple. Once again, it should be the actions of the individual and the evidence which is against them. That fucking simple. Next.
Implementing these changes will not prejudice male offenders.
Yeah, well, it already has. It already fucking has. 63% longer sentence for exactly the same crime. And you fucking piece of shit, are trying to widen that gap. So don't give me this, it's not going to affect male offenders bullshit. Next.
In fact, it is likely that the opposite will occur. It will encourage a normatively sound and empirically grounded assessment of sentencing law and policy.
So why not advocate for this regardless of gender? That's what I can't understand, right? Or apart from the fact that you're a gynocentric cunt, right? But if you're all about equality and fairness, why not advocate this for everyone? Why is it okay to advocate this for one special interest group? Now, if someone was advocating this type of thing for whites, for example, and not for blacks, it would be considered racist, with good reason. But once again, I have to make the point, apparently it's okay to do it when it comes to gender. Fucking bullshit. Next.
This would result in a bifurcated sentencing system, whereby imprisonment was largely reserved for only serious sexual and violent offenders. This approach would greatly benefit the approximately 50% of male U.S. and Australian inmates who are imprisoned for other types of crimes, such as drug and property offences.
Yep, then why not advocate for both males and females equally? Why not say that those who commit drug and property offences, regardless of gender, should have a different type of sentencing? Right now, I may or may not agree, depending on what you put forward, but at least if you put forward a non-gendered argument, I could respect that. But this gendered bullshit, where apparently women are expected to be treated with kid gloves and get special consideration because vagina, it's bullshit. It's offensive. Next.
The approach would save the community billions of dollars annually and go a long way to correcting the unfathomable public policy misstep which has resulted in 10 American states spending more on prisons than higher education. Best of all, it would not cause the slightest reduction to community safety.
Okay, so I'm almost out of time, so let's have a very quick look at some of the other articles. Why don't we start with Jezebel? And the title of the article is, Should We Stop Putting Women in Prison?
That argument, while it's sure to drive men's rights activists and fans of the penal system into a crimson-faced rage, was put forth with surprising persuasiveness in the Washington Post today by Patricia O'Brien, an associate professor at the Jane Addams College of Social Work at University of Illinois at Chicago.
Yeah, it is something to drive men's rights activists into a rage. With good fucking reason. It's a violation of human rights. Both men and women should have an equal and fair trial based on the crimes that they've committed and the facts which are presented. It shouldn't be based on gender. Next.
O'Brien writes that some members of Britain's House of Lords are advocating that the UK do just that, stop imprisoning women, full stop. It's a move mainly supported by the House's female members, including Baroness Jean Corsten, who in 2007 put out a report on the ways that English women are made especially vulnerable by the penal system. She didn't exactly argue that no woman should be in prison, but pointed out that in a system designed by and mostly stocked with men, women's needs weren't really being considered. We must find better ways to keep out of prison those women who pose no threat to society and to improve the prison experience for those who do, Corsten wrote in her executive summary. One example is the regular, repetitive, unnecessary overuse of strip searching in women's prisons, which is humiliating, degrading and undignified and a dreadful invasion of privacy. For women who have suffered past abuse, particularly sexual abuse, it is an appalling introduction to prison life and an unwelcome reminder of previous victimization.
So once again we have special consideration for females because they're female. These same considerations apparently don't apply to men who are in exactly the same circumstances. And apparently this is equality. Next.
This summer, another House of Lords peer, Baroness Healey of Primrose Hill, took up the cry, arguing in a June floor debate that women make up only 5% of the prison population, and serve, generally, very short terms for largely non-violent crimes. It is now accepted that short sentences have the worst reoffending outcomes, she said in her written remarks. More than half of all women leaving prison are reconvicted within 12 months. Of those serving sentences of less than 12 months, the reconviction rate rises to 62%. She argued that fewer custodial sentences, the kind where you get locked up, and more community-based rehabilitation would save money as well as allow women to make their amends to society without disrupting the lives of the families. 6 out of 10 women in prison in the UK have dependent children.
once again, can't these same arguments be made for men in exactly the same circumstances? Why do these circumstances apparently only apply to women? Next. So the next article is from the Washington Post, and it's called "We Should Stop Putting Women in Jail for Anything." Yeah, that's the actual title of the article, believe it or not. It's by Patricia O'Brien, who is an associate professor. Let's have a look.
The argument is actually quite straightforward. There are far fewer women in prison than men to start with. Women make up just 7% of the prison population. This means that these women are disproportionately affected by a system designed for men.
Okay, the fact that there are fewer women in prison does not mean that they should be treated differently. Now, you may want to reform the entire prison system. I can understand that, and I think there are some reasonable arguments for it, some not so reasonable as well. But what you don't do is say that a certain group should get special treatment or privileges because of, gender or race or anything like that. Next.
But could women prisons actually be eliminated in the United States, where the rate of women incarceration has risen by 646% in the past 30 years? The context is different, but many of the arguments are the same.
So, because female incarceration has risen 646% in 30 years, that means we should stop sending women to prison for some reason. Makes perfect sense when you think about it. Next.
Essentially, the case for closing women's prisons is the same as the case for imprisoning fewer men. It is the case against the prison industrial complex and for community-based treatment where it works better than incarceration. But there is evidence that prison harms women more than men, so why not start there?
So she admits that the case for closing women's prisons is the same case for imprisoning fewer men, right? So she's saying that the men and women in the same circumstances should essentially get the same treatment. But then she goes on to say, why not just start with women? Because, apparently prison harms women more. That's something I'm not convinced of. But why not base this on individual circumstances rather than gender? I mean, that, in my mind, would be a lot fairer. Next.
Any examination of the women who are in U.S. prisons reveals that the majority are non-violent offenders with poor education, little employment experience and multiple histories of abuse from childhood through adulthood.
And once again, we don't have a male comparison. So let's assume that this is true. Let's assume that many of the women in prison have multiple histories of abuse from childhood through adulthood. I think that is quite possibly true, but what's the male comparison? Are there less males with those circumstances? Are there more males? Are the males equal? We don't know because we're not told. We're just given half the story, and then we're left to make the assumption that this is only a factor for women. Of course, this is bullshit. And she also says that non-violent offenders with poor education and little employment experience. Okay, and there aren't men in those exact same circumstances? Of course there are. Why don't we give them the same consideration? Why is that so much to ask? If you were going to argue that people with poor education and little employment experience and little chance of actually getting proper employment are going to turn to non-violent crime, then surely that's the thing we should be addressing, not the fact that apparently it only affects women for some reason. So next we have an article from the Telegraph, and it's titled, "Isn't it time to abolish most women's prisons?"
A parliamentary campaign launched today from Sir Optimist and the Prison Reform Trust suggests women and their families are disproportionately affected by a jail term. Ahead of Vicky Pryce's expected release next month, Cathy Newman appraises the effectiveness of female imprisonment in the UK and considers the alternatives. More than 8 out of 10 of women sentenced and sent to prison have been convicted of non-violent offences. Many have young children, and some have themselves been victims of crime like domestic violence, sexual abuse and rape.
Okay, let's assume that these are all factors that we should take into consideration when sending someone to jail. Should we not also consider these circumstances in the case of men. If a male has young children which he has to care for, or he's been a victim of domestic or sexual abuse or rape, or he's committed a non-violent offence, then surely we should take these things into consideration exactly the same way we do with women. And what about the women who don't have these circumstances? Should they still get special fucking treatment? Because they do. It's that simple. They still get special treatment despite not having these actual circumstances. Why can't we eliminate gender from the equation and just focus on the circumstances of an individual case? Next.
The Prison Reform Trust Director Juliet Lyon told me, "It's clear that, without risk to the public, the government can act to save money and wasted lives by closing some women's prisons and investing instead in more effective community measures to reduce offending, including women's centers, probation supervision, restorative justice, treatment for addictions, mental health and social care, skills training and safe housing for women and their families."
But invest in these things only for women, right? I mean, the fact that apparently more men commit crime and go to prison means that we should focus entirely on women as opposed to males. Yeah, okay. Next.
So ministers are under pressure to get their act together. Helen Grant, the Justice Minister, announced plans last month to set up an advisory board on women offenders, saying at the time, women who commit crime should be punished, but we must not forget that a significant number have been victims during their lives and need targeted support to break the cycle of offending. Talking to me for this piece, she added, "It is important women receive the right balance of punishment and rehabilitation whether they serve sentences in prison or in the community. We want to see tough community sentences that properly punish, while supporting women to turn their backs on crime by addressing the issues causing them to offend. I will provide the strong leadership required to drive these priorities forward, and I'm confident that by working together with all partners we can better tackle female offending."
So in my mind, this is the perfect example of a gynocentric society, where if we look at comparable crimes between men and women, we make excuse after excuse after excuse for women, while saying who gives a shit about the men, right? I mean, a woman commits a crime, well, she must have been a victim, it can't be her fault, there must be other circumstances, she's going to suffer more than her male counterparts. There always must be some special consideration that we have to take into account when dealing with women, because apparently they're weaker, they're more fragile, they're less, they have less autonomy and responsibility, and somehow feminism calls this equality. I'm not exactly sure how that's equality. To me, it sounds like special treatment. So, yeah, look, once again, I have to give credit to those feminists who are actually speaking out against the sentencing gap. Even though there's only a handful of you, I still have to give you credit. Unfortunately, most are silent, and the ones who are speaking out, apart from that handful I just mentioned, are actually trying to widen the gap and make it bigger. This is fucking bullshit. It's a violation of human rights. It's gynocentrism gone mad, and it has absolutely nothing to do with equality. Now, there was a lot more material I wanted to get through, but just didn't have the time, so maybe I'll do another video on this sometime in the future. Some of the extra material I wanted to look at could probably have their own video. There's so much to go through. But I'm not going to do that now because I'm trying to keep these videos around the hour mark. Which means that's it for now, folks. So until next time.
Don't drink the poison Kool-Aid.
Now, in fairness, I think it's only right that I mention two more articles briefly. The first one was from Huffington Post, which actually talks about the sentencing gap and is trying to bring awareness to it. Now, technically, Huffington Post isn't a feminist publication, but they are very feminist friendly, so I do have to give them credit for at least trying to bring awareness to the subject. And the other article I want to briefly show is from a website called ifeminists.com from 2002, and although they didn't write the article, they did republish an article from the Los Angeles Daily Journal from someone who's a member of the National Coalition of Free Men. So I do have to give them credit for republishing the article and trying to bring awareness. To my knowledge, though, they haven't done anything since.